everyone. I want to bid you welcome today, that you have, give thanks that you have made it here for church in the afternoon, that you have come into this time to learn and to discover and to hopefully even make a friendship today. My name is Gregory Morrissey. I am one of two pastors here at the Plymouth Church. We are an open and affirming congregation of the United Church of Christ. And that basically just means that we are a church here on Edgell Road that is trying to do our best to offer an extravagant and wide welcome to any and all people who seek to be in community, whether you have all the questions figured out or whether you are just beginning to ask the question for yourself. This afternoon, just by way of some logistics, we do have some press here. So Framingham Access is going to video the presentation portion of our evening. Once we end that presentation and open up into questions and answers, the video will go off so that you are free to answer any question that may be on your heart. And we do encourage you to ask all of those questions because we believe that all questions help us to achieve a greater understanding. And you don't need to worry about that being filmed and broadcast out into the community. We also have the Metro West Daily News here. Will also be available if you have any quotes or if you have any questions. If you would like your name not to be used, just make sure that you specify that whenever you are talking to one of them. If you are in need of facilities this evening, we do have gendered bathrooms, women and men in this direction, and we also have a single stall bathroom in the kitchen, so you can just head through those doors and it's on your right. And there are baskets on the table for you. This is if you are so moved and inspired that you would like to give some money. This event was not free for us to put on, and we would like to give you that chance to give a little bit of money back, but also we're going to probably use some of those monies to further the education and ministry of our congregation and the open and affirming work that we do here at the Plymouth Church. There are also a number of handouts and flyers and informational pieces on your table. You are free to take all of those. If you would like to save some paper and save some of the planet's trees, on your way in you can sign your name and your email address, and we will email you all of the documents so that you can have a complete set at home and not worry about getting the papers mixed up or losing them or anything like that. If you have any other questions throughout the evening, feel free to speak to me, and we will tend to your needs as best we are able. At this time, I'd like to invite the chair of our Open and Affirming Committee, Joyce Miller, forward to introduce our presenter.
Chair, all this seems such a presumptuous task. I'm just the first one who stuck up my hand and said, let's do it. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm so pleased. I thought there were going to be 10 of us here, really. And I'm so pleased. Today's event is, as Greg mentioned, is part of the Plymouth Church's celebration of our 3rd anniversary as an open and affirming congregation. We are number 1100 in the United Church of Christ. While we were pursuing our process, we passed rather quickly over transgender issues. Beyond Caitlin and closer to home is our attempt to rectify that by offering an opportunity to engage the issue of transgender justice in a safe and non-judgmental space. We will become familiar with some of the terms used in talking about gender identity and gender expression and learn how to be supportive. When the ONA committee began looking for a presenter, Louis Mitchell immediately came to my mind. Louis is the assistant minister at South Congregational Church, focusing on adult faith formation and social justice. He is a pioneering, intentional man, perhaps he'll tell us what he means by that, an elder and an advocate who serves as the consultant for community engagement for the Transfaith Interfaith Working Group. Louis has been involved in the fight for health, respect, and self-determination since the early 1980s, with deep engagement in political, mental health, recovery, and Black church contexts. Among a long list of accomplishments, Lewis was the first out transgender identified board member of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force and a founding member of Lesbians and Gays of African Descent for Democratic Action. He was profiled in the documentary Still Black, a portrait of Black trans men. He served as a founding member of the Trans Saints Ministry of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. He received the 2011 Haystack Award from the Mass Conference of the UCC for his work in social justice and social ministry, and was honored with the 2015 Claire Skippington Vanguard Award from the Transgender Law Center for his longtime advocacy for the disenfranchised. And he was named as one of the 10 leading Black religious leaders advancing LGBTQ justice by a wonderful group called Believe Out Loud. Please welcome Minister Lewis Mitchell.
I want you to take a moment to forget that long list of stuff. What that means is that I travel a lot and I sleep very little. And more than that, it means that when I'm called upon to be of service, more often than not I say yes. My story is not unique or special, I just happen to be visible and available more than some. First, intentional man, I'm going to go back to that. Trans folk identify ourselves in a lot of different ways. I typically identify myself as an intentional man, which means I became a man on purpose. It wasn't an accident of birth. I put in the time, effort, resources, study, which means I've been studying all men around me. So even when you think people aren't looking, people are noticing how you're doing what you do. Just beware. And I lived into my manhood in such a way that I want to be intentional about the type of man I am, as well as the ways in which I represent manhood. So that takes care of that. I want to thank Plymouth and the hosts committee and the host pastors in this church, and really all of you for welcoming me into your world today. I am going to do some things that may make you uncomfortable, but not super uncomfortable. Well, maybe super uncomfortable, but not embarrassingly, well, maybe embarrassingly uncomfortable. I'm going to do some things, and we're going to do some things together, not to embarrass you really, but to really kind of explain and maybe embody some ways in which transness can be experienced by people. But before we do all that, if you would please just join me for a moment of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you first and foremost for your love of us. We thank you for the creative ways in which you've made us, and we thank you for the questions in our heart for those that are unlike us, somewhat like us, just like us. We just thank you for our inquisitive hearts. We ask you, God, that you open us up right now, that you open those tender places and you allow us to be vulnerable and sweet with each other, to be merciful and graceful with one another as you have modeled for us. Fill us with new life, God, and please, God, use me. Use me in this moment to be an emissary of your love, your grace, and your humility. We ask and we thank you for all these things. In the name of Jesus, amen. Amen. So now I'm going to need some volunteers. One volunteer from each table. Raise your hand. There's one. One volunteer. You guys decide. Fight it out. So this, well, I need a volunteer from your table. I didn't see a hand go up. Y'all fight it out. I've got volunteers at every table except that back table. Okay, there we go. Volunteers at the table, you know who you are. Raise your hand. One at each table. What I want you to do is I want you to take your shoes off and I want you to reverse the feet and put them back on. Yep, take your shoes off. Reverse them around, put them back on. And you will be that way until the end of the presentation, and I'll explain more to you about what that is in a little while. This is the moment that you probably are hoping you didn't wear that pair of stylish stilettos. It is what it is. This is really the height of the embarrassing part, just so you know. This was it. I'm going to start by giving you some basic statistics and get that out of the way. That, for me, is the least engaging part of anything I have to say. The stats are based on real life of people, but the stories of people are far more engaging than numbers. In the 2014 analysis of the National Transgender Discrimination Study by the Williams Institute, found this is really bizarre writing right here, found that more people have been bullied at school to anti-transgender bias and had attempted suicide. Among people who experience physical or sexual violence in school, a startling 78% have attempted suicide. 78%. Among the respondents who reported that their parents and or families stopped speaking to them or spending time with them after coming out as transgender, 57% had tried to end their lives. What's especially telling about this aspect of the survey is that the people whose familial relationships remained strong reported a significantly lower suicide attempt rate at 33%. The National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs offered alarming statistics about violence against trans people, revealing that trans women of color are especially at risk. 72% of victims of anti-LGBT homicide were transgender women. 67% of anti-LGBT homicide victims were trans women of color. I don't know if you know this. How many of you are familiar with the Trans Day of Remembrance? Trans Day of Remembrance happens every year. We started here in Massachusetts to honor the life and to lift up the tragedy of the death of Rita Hester, one of our own. I'm going to suggest to you that if you're not familiar with it, it's in your packet. It's in one of the packets there which gives you some information to look up different things. But check out Trans Day of Remembrance. And also Trans Week of Visibility, which was added more recently because we didn't want to all just come together once a year to mourn. We also wanted to come together to celebrate. To put these numbers that I gave you in perspective, consider that transgender survivors and victims only made up 13% of the total number of hate violence reports. Only 13%, yet trans women accounted for almost 3/4 of the year's total hate violence fatalities. It's very hard. I was trying to look up just how many of us are there. And no one really knows. The nearest estimate is 3%. Why do we not know? Well, because the census doesn't ask. The CDC does not qualify us adequately. How many of you work in medical or healthcare or social services? In recent history, we'll have things like male, female, or trans, which tells you nothing about who that person is, what parts and pieces they have, how they use them, and what risk they have. We've also added in some places FTM and MTF, female to male, male to female, which also doesn't answer any questions about what parts and pieces you have, how you use them, and what risk you have. We have a long way to go to understand more about trans lives and trans bodies. Now, I need you to grab something for me. It should be on your table. It's called the Gender Unicorn. Before we launch into the Gender Unicorn, let me ask you a question, so I know where we are. How many of you still from time to time confuse gender identity with, and I don't like the term sexual orientation because that isn't really what we're all about. I prefer to use the term affectional orientation because it's not about who you have sex with, it's about who you love. You may, if you are a sexual being and not asexual, choose to have sex with that person, but it is quite ableist to assume that that is what makes you love who you love. So I'm going to use affectional orientation in this moment. How many of you confuse gender identity with affectional orientation from time to time? Yep. Okay, we've got a few hands. I'm going to give you the shortcut. Are you ready? It's going to make it so easy, it's going to boggle your mind. You ready? Your affectional orientation is who you may go to bed with. Your gender identity is who you go to bed as. Now, that is binary in nature, but it allows you some room to understand that they're not connected in the way that people think that they are. So, One of the things that happens in LGBT world is we do these really bizarre binary tricks where we say LGBT or straight, assuming that there aren't trans people that are straight. I have news for you, we also have affectional orientation. We are not just our gender, and probably the majority of trans folk would identify as straight. So then they're kind of torn about which table to sit at, the LGBT table or the straight ally table. So understand that orientation is more fluid than you might believe. Off to the gender unicorn. Your gender identity, your gender expression, the sex you were assigned at birth, who you are physically attracted to, and who you're emotionally attracted to, may line up in really different ways. And I want you to take 3 minutes now at your individual table, and I want you to go around and express to one another each of those places in your own life. Just take 3 minutes to do that. Start with, this is my gender identity, this is how I express myself, this is the sex I was assigned at birth, this is who I'm physically attracted to, and this is who I'm emotionally attracted to. If you don't feel comfortable doing it, you may pass. But I hope that many of you will feel comfortable doing it. Just take a moment. If I can rein you back in, I know this is the tables were bigger than I anticipated in terms of being more populated. But I want to leave as much time as I can for question and answers.
As far as I know.
So far in life.
You guys rock so hard for participating. Thank you for that. Give yourselves a hand for participating in that, because that's some risk taking. It's not often, those of you that are cisgender and straight identified, cisgender meaning that you were identified at birth in the gender that you also feel comfortable with right now. Those of you that are cisgender and straight, how often do people actually ask you these questions about how you identify? Never? Let me just say that if I had $1 for every time someone asked me these questions, I would never have to work again. And all of my student loans would be paid. And my mother's house would be paid off. Just, my kid would have a trust fund. One of the things that I want to note is that with trans folk, there seems to be incredible permission to just be invasive about us, out of curiosity. Really? So you're not gay? Well, what? How? None of your business. If we're close enough that you should know that, probably you do. And if we're not close enough, like if I'm in the grocery store, that's probably not the time to ask about my medical history. And you're laughing, but I've had people come up to me in the grocery store and say, by the way, have you had that surgery? Like, is that on sale today? Or what aisle is that on? I thought I was just getting vegetables. I want to start by saying that trans is a self-identifier. Yes?
Is cis, C-I-S, does it stand for something?
It is Latin for same.
For same.
And in the packet that looks like, I don't remember what I called it, this, there's a whole glossary of terms. That's why I wanted you to have this, because I'm not going to go through every term today, but there's a lot of them. And I want you to be familiar with them and be able to reference it. Trans is a self-identifier. Trans is a self-identifier. Trans is a self-identifier. I say that because there are people who you might identify as trans who may not self-identify in that way. In the trans community, there is this huge diversity of people. It might be someone who is a cross-dresser, or a drag king, or someone who is non-binary or gender non-conforming, someone who identifies as gender queer, but often when we think about transgender, what we're really talking about is transsexual. Someone who has gone from female to male, or male to female. But we are not the entirety of the trans community, nor have we ever been. But with Chaz Bono and Caitlyn Jenner and others, we certainly get a lot of the press. For better or for worse, we get a lot of the press. There are also people who are within that community who identify their transness as a medical condition that once corrected is no longer a condition. So they may have fully transitioned and no longer identify as trans. It is not okay for us to say, well, but you were born a little such and such, so of course you're trans. Trans is a self-identifier. I know that's hard for folks, but it is a measure of respect. Also, one of the things that I have happen so often is people who I've known for 5, 6, 7, 8 years will say, well, I've never met a trans person before. Well, yeah, you kind of have, but we've also shared the same restroom and eaten together, but you didn't know, so you didn't know. Everyone who is trans is not out. They're not undisclosed because they're ashamed. They're undisclosed because that is their personality and that is their disclosure choice. People have a right to disclose along with their personality, not because it makes people feel comfortable that they know who the trans people are in the room. I want to offer you some gifts for making a trans-inclusive family, worship space, and workspace. Gift number 1, try to avoid body references in a gendered way. What do I mean by that? Well, one of my favorite people in the world is my former pastor, Bishop Yvette Funder. Bishop and I have this conversation about every 2 or 3 months. Because Bishop is in the habit of saying brothers and sisters all the time, which drives me bonkers. Bishop also preached at Awakenings a few years ago, and she kept talking about women who gave birth. Women who gave birth. Women who gave birth. Now, I knew that there were actually people in the congregation, in that audience, who were not women, who had also given birth. And so what I propose is that you can actually say, people who have given birth. That allows women who have not or cannot give birth to not feel like there's something isolating about their experience. It also allows people who are not women, who have given birth, to feel included in the statement, which is about an experience, a bodily experience that they might share with other people in the room, if not excluded from it. Make sense? The other things that are important to do when you can are keep in mind that when you use terms like straight, you may be talking about people within the larger LGBT community. I mentioned that, but I want to reinforce that because it's really important, I think, to many of the folks that I know. When greeting people, as much as you can, be more open to language that is more inclusive rather than exclusive. That's on one of the sheets here. When greeting others, avoid ladies, gentlemen, ma'am, sir, girls, boys, etc. Consider using thanks, friends. Good morning, folks. Hi, everyone. And for you, can I get you all something? I like the word kindred in worship spaces. It works for me. When I say welcome kindred, I'm not claiming you as family, as I might by using brothers and sisters, but it allows people who are not binary identified to also be a part of. Let me talk about that for a moment, and let me also say that I have some privilege points that I need to own right now. I have male privilege in a society that is decidedly sexist. I have Christian privilege in a society that privileges Christianity among other faith journeys. I have adult privilege because I'm 55. Older than I've ever been. I have binary privilege in that I identify as a man, and F and M are options for my legal paperwork. F and M are things that are asked in almost everything I apply for. If one is non-binary, they do not have that luxury. They're not going to put a question mark or leave it blank on your driver's license because that's the truth of your identity. Binary is a privilege. I'm learning that as a binary person. I also have blending privilege. And let me just say, I don't like the term passing because it has some connotations for me as an African American that I'm not fond of. So I prefer to use the term blending. Which means that unless I disclose, no one ever questions me about my medical history or my gender history. That is a privilege. It means that I don't worry when I walk into the store. Not about being trans, I may worry about being black, but that's a whole other story. That's not what we're going to talk about. Although they do collude. But, it's important to understand that many of my siblings and my kindred around the country, particularly people who do not have blending privilege, It is an ordeal for them every time they leave their houses. If they want to go to the market, if they want to get on public transportation. Because we live in a world, and I'm going to say that this is really rooted in sexism, and homophobia is also rooted in sexism, I believe, that and I'm going to use a woman in this case, I'm going to use this example. If a woman does not look in this small prescribed way that women are allowed to look, then people feel allowed and permitted to assault them verbally or worse, whether that person was assigned female at birth or not. The best example is one of my favorite athletes of all time. Her name was Margot Didek. She played for the Utah WNBA team, which I can't remember the name of right now. Sparks, maybe? No, that was LA. Margot Didek was, I think, 6'3" or 6'4", or something like that. And everywhere she went, people questioned her gender. Were you a little girl, or you? And Margot handled it gracefully as a professional, but if you're too tall, or too short, or too round, or too flat, or you have some whiskers here, and you wig your hair like that, people feel like they can just say things to you if you're a woman. Less so for men, but in some cases. In addition, and this is where the sexism and the homophobia interact with one another, if someone who is perceived as male is seen as less than masculine, there is that same response that people feel as though they can hurl insults and or fists or bottles or other things. I submit to you that those things are all rooted in sexism and hatred of the feminine and policing of femininity in all of its forms. So much of what we do in fighting transphobia is not just limited to that. It is also an investment in fighting sexism and doing anti-sexist work. They're hand in hand. The people that suffer the most are largely trans women and trans women of color who are not able to blend. There is not a week that goes by for me in my personal life that I am not being reached out to because someone is grieving someone who was brutally murdered. There just isn't. We are now in April, and I don't have the current count, but I want to say globally, I know that there's been more than one death for days, more than one death for every day of this year globally. Many of those in the United States, and brutal deaths. These are people who, some of them, at least domestically, are people who I have embraced and had conversations with. Most of them under the age of 30. That impacts me deeply, and it makes my work so much more than theoretical. For me, it is personal that we learn how to embrace one another. And let me tell you why it's important for us as churches to do that. Because as churches, we are often the front line of attack rather than the front line of refuge. When you look at the things going on in other places around the country, and I do not want to let us off the hook, please know that there is an accommodations bill right now that needs our work in Massachusetts. Right now. I don't have them in front of me. Senate Bill 1355 and House Bill 755, I think. Y'all will have to look them up. But we're still waiting, and I encourage you, if you would, please call Governor Baker and say, really? Really? What are we, Georgia? Come on now, dude. Get with it. Because what that means is that on public transportation and in hotels, and yes, in fact, in bathrooms, trans people cannot be safe, even though trans women suffer the same threats of violence, plus some, that all women do. We are so accustomed in Massachusetts to be trailblazers, it is truly disappointing that we are not in this regard. I want to try to get through a couple of things before I get to this. There's this sheet on your table. This is your cheat sheet on how to behave with trans folk in your life. If you need to, you can shrink it down to wallet size and pull it out anytime you need to. One of the things, and this happened to me actually this week, which is fascinating, at the Boundary Awareness Training. I had a talk with a couple of fellow pastors in the association, and they said, well, what's your real name? I said, you mean other than the one I introduced myself as? Because That's the one I've got. What's your real name? Do you have something else you go? A boo, or Buddy Fluffy, or whatever you? What did your mama call you? And it's one of those things that I know you're curious, but it's none of your business. Many people in the community call that dead naming for a reason. Most of us have had to work hard and spend money to legalize our identities. Please do not let your curiosity mean more to you than our safety and our sense of ourselves, please. If we offer that to you, that's one thing. And if we offer that to you, we are not offering that to you to share. I will tell you now, there are plenty of people, you should never out anyone about anything. But you have my permission to out me anywhere you'd like. And I'm telling you that because I need to be visible so that men like me know that men like me exist. I am one of the people, in terms of, as particularly trans men of color, I am one of the only visible ones that is grown. You know what I mean? A lot of younger guys are transitioning, and once we transition, many of us, we become invisible, so they never know, like, do I get to be grown and have a family in a house someday? Because first I saw you on YouTube and then you vanished. I never heard from you again. I don't know what happened. It's important to respect names and pronouns. If you don't know, ask, and try not to let what you see trump what you hear. That make sense? So if you see someone that looks like me, and I say, she, her, and hers, she, her, and hers. That's it. That's it. You don't have to ask me, well, where are you in your transition? None of your business. She, her, and hers. If I wanted to put all that information on a name tag, I'd get a bigger name tag. It's important to show your support, and what that might look like is it might look like saying, I don't know, but I can listen. It might say, this is really hard for me, will you pray for me? It might mean, you know what, let me refer you to someone that knows a little bit more than I do, and can I come along so I can be educated? You don't have to be an authority to be supportive. You just have to be respectful. I want to go through the things on your table, not because I'm going to go over them right now, but there is a Trans Respect and Etiquette Support 101 sheet there that you can also have emailed to you. That's going to talk a lot about self-identification. It's going to go more in depth on the things that I've touched on very lightly. You've got when reading others. You've got how to be a trans ally. This thing that I did for the fellowship, which I call the product, it has a list of resources in the back, films and books and websites that you can go to get more information. I want to offer one film to you, not the one I'm in, which is, I wouldn't do that to you. There's a film called Normal. How many of you have ever seen that film? Normal? Oh my gosh, it is so good. It's so good. It's one of the best. Jessica Lange is in it. It was made for HBO. You can find it on Netflix or someplace else, but if you have a chance to even do a showing at your church of the film Normal, it is one of the best commercial films I have ever seen that discusses the nuances of transition. The lead character, who's Tom Wilkinson, who's brilliant in this, is somewhere in the Midwest, some little town, where he's a member of a church, works for some tractor company or something. It talks about the nuance with him and his father, and him and his children, and his wife, played by Jessica Lange, and it is magnificent. Magnificent. If you have not seen it, I encourage you to see it. It really, if that doesn't tug at your heart, I'm going to suggest that you need a checkup and an EKG stat, because it is really so brilliantly done. There are many, many, many people in the world who live in the ways that we live. What does it mean to us as people of faith and witness? One of the questions I get asked all the time is, do you think God made a mistake? Any of you ever think that when you meet someone trans? Do you think God made a mistake? Does God make mistakes like that? There are some people that do believe that God made a mistake. I am not one of them. I believe that God made me just like this. That somehow God saw in me some brilliant wisdom that I could walk this path and not lose my entire mind. And that hasn't always been the case. I will tell you, at 55 years old and into my 17th year as a man, and I want to tell you, the reason why I look so good at 55 is because I got to restart. So I'm only 17 in boy years, and that really helps a lot. That keeps my energy up and makes me feel really good. But prior to this incarnation, I spent a fair amount of years lost in my addiction. I am currently 32 years clean and sober, for which I'm truly grateful. And I did a lot of self-harm. I survived my own suicide attempts, my own assaults, all of those things, not because I was running from my transness, I was just running. I didn't even know what I was running from. I knew when I was 3 years old that I wasn't the little girl that people were calling me. I came out as a lesbian because that's what you called people with the body I had that were attracted to women, but I also knew that wasn't quite the fit. And I remember my first little girlfriends, I would say, would you still like me if I was a boy? And they would say, why are you asking? And I still didn't know why I was asking. Because I was born in 1960, I had heard of Renee Richards and Christine Jorgensen. I mean, there was such a thing as a trans woman, but there was no such thing as a trans man, ever, anywhere. So it was an impossibility. And when I met men who transitioned the first time, my first emotional response was anger, because it was no longer a fantasy and now I had hard decisions to make. Not the least of which was, how do I tell my mama? I was terrified of telling my mom. My dad passed away in '91. I am my mother's only child. And my mother was so religious growing up, we called her the Mother Superior. I was terrified that my mother would say things that I won't repeat. Two things spurred me into my transition. One, I was very active in the lesbian community, and the women's community, and the butch femme community, and the womanist community. And I realized when I was standing at a microphone doing the Dyke March one year that I was taking away an opportunity from a woman in community because I wouldn't get out of the way. There were so few opportunities, particularly for women of color, that I was stealing one out of fear really upset me. The second and more important thing that caused me to transition when I did was I realized that on some level part of me was waiting for my mother to die for me to live. And I didn't want any part of me to be wishing her demise. Even if I lost her, at least she would live. That spurred me into transition. I began identifying as trans. I began medical transition in '99. I sent my mother a letter. Snail mail. Not an email, not a text message, not a phone call. No, I went the super slow, cowardly way. I sent her a letter. And she sent me back a letter. And she said in her inimitable way, I know enough to go to the throne before I pick up the phone. And I prayed, and I may never accept or understand what you're doing, but I will always love you. And I couldn't ask for anything more than that. Since that time, shortly after that, my mother and my stepbrother and I met in Palm Springs, and we had what I call the first post-transition family caucus, where she asked me a lot of really embarrassing and invasive questions, and I gave her all the answers I had. Since that time, she has become one of my greatest advocates, and she's the one that says to family members, he has not gone by that name in 16 years. Get with the program, honey. We talk theology now. We talk about the love of God and the ways that God can incarnate people who are unworthy in so many other ways and make use of them. We talk about broken vessels and what we have in common. We don't talk about the ways in which our theologies are different. We talk about the ways in which God doesn't care about our theologies as much as our love and our service. Truly a miracle. When I was a little kid, all I wanted to do was be a husband and a father. I am a recently unhinged husband. My unwife and I just celebrated our first anniversary last Thursday. We would have been married 14 years on Thursday. We've been together a little over 16 years. And she has a get-out-of-jail-free card from me because when we got together, I had no notion that I would ever be called to ministry. She is not called her purpose to be the wife of a minister. And I free her to find the joy and the purpose in her life because that's a special role to be coupled with someone in ministry. If that's not your calling, nothing's going to make it your calling, boo. You're just going to be miserable and stuff, dragged along through the process. You know, and so I feel like I love her too much to make her a hostage. And we have a daughter, Kalo, who will be 4 years old in July, and she is the joy of my life. That impossible thing that I wanted as a child, when I say impossible, I mean it was impossible. There was no way that could ever happen to a little girl in West Covina in 1964. Never. All of those things are true in my life. I am sober. I have a wonderful partner and a wonderful co-parent, an amazing daughter, a beautiful life, a God who loves me, a mother who loves and respects me. I am holy, divine, and present in my incarnation. The possibilities never would have happened if any one of those suicide attempts had been successful. So when I talk to you about how we do this work so that we help prevent suicide, so that we help prevent violence, it is not about me or you. It's about the possibilities that we keep alive. The possibilities for God's love, the possibility for lessons, the possibilities for hope of a broader community. That we can all participate in, even with our limited understanding.